Hello, good afternoon. I'm welcome to a specially made talk for you and for us today on old myths, now I've forgotten it. Old myths, new story. My name's Josephine Burton and I am Artistic Director of Dash Arts. And I'm also the director of Dido's Bar, which is a production that's currently running in the Royal Docks until tomorrow, and then we go on tour across the UK, including Leicester and Portsmouth and Oxford. And in fact, I'm just back from Manchester today, where we had a little version of the show in Manchester earlier in the week. So I'm in the thick of this amazing production, Dido's Bar, which was retelling the old story of the Aeneid, the old myth of the refugee that comes from Troy across the sea to the west. And telling it in a contemporary way. And it really led to today's conversation, which is really about what it is to take an old story and reinterpret it and retell it in a contemporary setting. And we are doing it sort of live today with a couple of speakers. Unfortunately, Maya, who is joining us, is a little bit delayed in London traffic and she's en route, but I'm totally privileged to have with me Colin Nightingale, who's a creative producer and an artist. And by strange coincidence, also currently in the thick of several shows, several artistic projects that also retell old myths in contemporary settings in East London. So it just felt like a kind of too good an opportunity to miss, to meet Colin and to talk to him about like what is so exciting about taking these old stories and reinterpreting them or looking at them through new lenses. And then bring in Maya, the wonderful musician Maya Youssef, who will be able to talk about it from a slightly different perspective. Maya's a wonderful musician, and she takes old stories and old songs and old myths and reinterprets them through her music. So shortly we'll be joined by Maya as well. But in the meantime, we're going to kick off with Colin. And Colin, I'm really interested. Is there like a particular myth that you're quite obsessed with at the moment, that may or may not be anything to do with the shows that you're making?
I think in terms of myths, I mean, I feel like we're surrounded by them, and the type of way I work on projects, what I love is the fact that I end up learning things from other people, because people are always bringing these stories or inspirations that then become projects, and they end up being my portal to then learn about those things. But I think on a personal level, I think these days what I think I'm more interested in is, I'm interested in a lot of South American culture, and I think what I'm fascinated there is the way that some of the myths feel so intertwined with the actual culture, and it's hard to actually differentiate between what's kind of fantastical and what's actually reality. And I'm quite obsessed with a tribe called the Kogi, who kind of like see themselves as the keepers of the world, and they're like Big Brother, and they have all the knowledge, and they see all the Western people as Little Brother. And Little Brother's a bit stupid because Little Brother keeps doing things that are damaging the planet. Right. But I find like the whole thing is like a myth, but they live it and they're in it. So I think that's my kind of personal passion. But as I said, what I always love, and yeah, I've been fortunate over the last year or so, as you say, to work on a couple of projects where actually myths are at the core of what the storytelling is. And actually with both of those projects, they've maybe been, as I say, my portal to actually engaging with that story and understanding more and learning more about it. And that's always fun to me.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I want to talk about those projects in a minute, but that leads me on to a reflection on what my I guess if I was going to be asked today what my favourite myth is, because it changes all the time. We're just about to come to the end of a programme of work that we've been doing at Dash Arts called the E-Utopia, which was sort of it was a programme of work that was instigated and inspired by the Brexit referendum in 2016, when I just thought, here's this whole part of our identity, this European Union, or this political part of our identity that is being rejected by half of the country, more than half of the country. And what does it mean? What does it mean to be European? And what is Europe anyway? So this has been this programme of work that we've been going through for the last 5 years, and it's sort of culminating with Dido's Bar, that I hope we'll come back to. We're about to start a new journey, and the new journey it's currently called Albion. It's a sort of exploration of Englishness in its kind of diverse contemporary form. And I've become quite interested in the myths of the giants of Albion, which is completely like fascinating. It's this sort of Anglo-Norman myth. I don't know if you like know anything about it. I've been learning a little bit that there were these 30 sisters, Albina and her sisters, who showed up in this like abandoned island of Britain. I think they were exiled, and they showed up, and they inhabited it, and it was totally barren, and they've kind of fed themselves on nuts for a while, and they ended up sleeping with ghosts or incubi, I mean kind of weird spirits that lived on the island, and they had giants. They gave birth to giants. So like I don't know, I saw Jerusalem recently, and Jez Butterworth has the Albion giants in it, so I guess I was just kind of alerted to it through that. But I love this idea of this kingdom of Britain just being inhabited by giants. And now look at us. We've shrunk a little bit. So that's the myth I'm quite interested in. I don't know if it will lead to a story, but it's definitely a way in. As you said, it's a way into understanding something.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the bit I think that's exciting, that you said there, you know, like there's a reference within Jerusalem to something that then suddenly gets something on your radar, or suddenly makes you, because maybe you've seen it before, but I always find those, it's that thing that allows you to just sort of step over the line and go deeper into something. And that's what, I mean, for me, yeah, just over the years, all the different projects I've been in, that's always been the exciting thing to me, because I've, like my background, I'm not hugely academic, and I didn't, I haven't studied the classics, I haven't done any of these things, and I always find it so great in life, and the kind of choices that I've been able to make in my life, and the things that I've been exposed to, just how much richer everything becomes when I start to learn all these new stories.
So tell us about these two new stories. So it's Charon, as I keep getting the name wrong, Charon, which is a piece that's just been at the Greenwich and Docklands International Festival. Yeah, and it's also there's the Burnt City, which is the Punchdrunk show, which is happening on the other side of the river from where Dido's Bar is in East London. Tell us about those shows, because they're both right. They've both got classical myths at their core.
Definitely, and it's both basically it's Greek. At the core of it. And I think probably both projects help explain a little bit about how I work. So Charon is actually a kinetic sculpture. It was made by an artist called Peter Hudson, and it's actually a piece of artwork that had been at Burning Man. So it was originally shown, I think it was in 2011 there, and would have been out on the desert plains, and it would have, and I think it's a 32-foot high, it looks a little bit like a Ferris wheel, but actually it's a vertical zoetrope. And if people engage with the artwork and start pulling ropes, then it spins, and on the wheel are skeletons that are holding an oar that, as it starts to spin, that you realise they're actually paddling, and they are a representation of Charon, and Charon is the ferryman on the River Styx, and the whole piece is about it's about death, and it's actually about a circle of life, and it's a very we had a lot of conversations with Peter about the work to try and understand it, and the way I ended up working on that project was Bradley, who runs Greenwich and Docklands festivals. I worked with Bradley a long time ago, and he was bringing this piece in, and it was going into a very barren piece of land in Canning Town. It's right by the train station, and it was previously tied up with the Crossrail development, and suddenly has become vacant. And Royal Docks and TfL are very keen to work out how to activate this bit of barren land. And what Greenwich and Docklands Festivals is so good at is identifying new sites. And yeah, Bradley had this vision. He wanted to bring Peter's artwork over, and it had this site. And originally Bradley was talking to me about thinking about music programming to go alongside it, to complement it, and to turn it into a bit more of a sense of a festival and a celebration. And what ended up happening is I sort of said, well, I really want to talk to Peter and understand more about what the artwork's about. And also I need to go and see the site, because I'm always trying to think about audiences and how audiences engage with artwork, and trying to find the right context for that work. And we went to the site, and it was really barren. And I was quite nervous that this artwork was maybe needed some support. Otherwise it could feel a little lost in this site. and you know, it's not the way it was originally conceived, where it was sitting in a desert and people had cycled their bikes or walked for ages to get to this thing, and then you get the reveal of what it is, and then you interact with it. And then we sort of had conversations with Peter, and he explained the origins of it all, and it very much was made to celebrate the life of friends of his that had kind of died, and also it's all about bringing people together. But there are obviously, you know, sort of themes of, you know, the sort of contemplation that we all go through around death, but then also, you know, if the sense of a circle of life and renewal and all of that stuff is obviously important into it when it's going into a site like Canning Town, which is going through renewal and regeneration in the way that everywhere does in a city. And myself and Stephen Dobby, who I work quite closely with, who's a sound designer, basically ended up presenting a whole sort of idea back to Peter and the festival about how we wanted to create a journey through sound on the way into the site, and we created a kind of a circular compound that the piece was going to be in, so it was slightly obscured, so you would actually discover it. And also, we really like working with artists and sort of understanding what's at the core of their piece, and then sort of holding a mirror up to it and then reflecting ideas back to them that they like. And in the piece, on one side, when you view it, when it's animating, when it's spinning, on one side of it, you'll see hands that are clawing at the boat. And obviously that's got all those themes about, you know, just the sort of, I don't know, the foreboding nature of death and the kind of, like the natural kind of fear everyone has of it all, and sort of trying to get to the other side and what all that kind of means. And then on the other side of it, are birds that are animated that are flying off, and that's obviously representing this sense that there is a circle and there's a future and there's an afterlife and all of these things. And so we kind of presented back an idea, and on the route in we had these fire barrels that had fire in them, and they were reverse silhouettes, and so you would see as you entered the site, and with the sound that you were journeying with, the hands would basically guiding you to it. And then on the way out, there was a more optimistic sound that was actually guiding you out, and you just saw the birds flying off.
That sounds gorgeous. How did how much of that myth of the ferryman do you think that landed with the audiences or the communities around Canning Town?
I think it was very present in the press that was around it. I think that piece, and I think Peter, sort of meeting him, it's not massively hugely important for them to fully understand it. Yeah. Because also what we actually came to understand more when it was actually on site was how important it is for him to actually engage with the artwork and make it work, and you have to work together as a team to pull things. And I think some of those themes actually were big to him, but you know, really I think for him it's obviously the inspiration, and a lot of the kind of death and renewal stuff is actually quite personal to him. But what they love in the process of people actually engaging and pulling things, some of the crew will then start talking to local people about what the piece is about, and then they suddenly start to understand it. And again, they maybe get their portal into then going and learning about the ferryman and the River Styx, which they might not know anything about.
Was there a coin involved?
We didn't physically give a coin, but the symbol, on the way into the site, we created an archway, and on the top of the archway, there's a symbol for the piece, which is a skeleton's hand with a coin in it. So people will have seen that on the way into it.
Right. It's really weird, actually, because I'm just suddenly realizing as I was listening to you, there is the myth that the myth. It's not really a myth. I mean, it's sort of a myth. The inspiration for Dido's Bar, but it's based on an old poem, like an old epic long poem, written in Roman myth rather than the Greek myth, set of the story of Aeneas who crosses the sea. But halfway through the story, he goes down into the underworld, the hero Aeneas, and he has this interaction with Charon, and crosses the water. And there's this incredibly graphic, quite difficult scene with all of those people on the riverbank, desperately kind of scrambling to get on a boat. And I was just wondering if Peter read that original story as part of his research. I imagine he probably did.
Yeah.
It's amazing, that journey into the underworld. And I really struggled with how we'd tell that part of the story in our show, because we have really followed the narrative of the story. Like, you know, our show basically follows very closely to the story of the refugee, his arrival in Carthage, his gorgeous love affair, and then very tragic love affair with Dido, through to his journey to Italy. But in our version of the show, he just goes to a push up, more upmarket bar in town, and then has all the encounters towards the end of the story. And we sort of, I'm ashamed to say, missed the underworld trip, because it just felt sort of like it was a whole show in itself, and it was kind of really hard to kind of contemporize that incredible journey into the underworld. So maybe, you know, you did that. Your work did that for us in East London without us needing to do it.
Yeah.
It's just like a nice idea to think about.
And I always think this sense that when these myths and things are being used essentially as inspiration for a project, and then you're making something new out of it, it is that ability that you can maybe miss things.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's sort of interesting. So the other project I've been working on, which is Punchdrunk show, The Burnt City, and Punchdrunk's a company that I've kind of been involved with for about 20 years, and I work as a creative producer on it, but I kind of sit in the creative team. But my real role in that is very much thinking about the audience's experience, and less so the kind of the sort of more classic approach to a creative of if you were taking that kind of show. But I obviously am very involved in it, and I kind of witness it. And at the Burnt City, there's essentially kind of two core stories that are with the sort of main source text. So it's looking at Agamemnon and it's looking at Hecuba. But then in the way that the work's actually created, in a similar way, you can't actually do justice to everything there, and you may be, you know, a combination of you don't necessarily have all the characters. There's so many characters and they're so rich, but it becomes like a jumping off point. And I think in a lot of ways in Punchdrunk work, it's creating this kind of dreamlike reality, and then things get even more confused in a Punchdrunk show because there's lots of other kind of source texts that come in, or inspirations, and so we ended up, it's this very much this kind of world building. But at the core of the Burnt City are these themes that have come out in these stories, and a lot of those themes are actually just around kind of war and the futility of war, and, you know, the fact that there's no real winners or losers. And I think in a lot of, when Punchdrunk shows are working at their best, what they're really trying to do is actually get across those key themes. And sometimes when we're making the work, there's a lot of conversations around, like, ultimately what do we want an audience to kind of leave feeling, and the work is fragmented and it happens all over. I mean, for people who maybe don't know about this show, it's across probably over 120,000 square foot of space, and we have basically created Greece, and we've created Troy, because the stories we're telling out are basically looking, basically it's the siege of Troy, and it's at the point of the fall of Troy. And it's huge, and there's 35 performers, and it's basically the performance happens all over the space. And for an audience member, you end up with a very fragmented experience of the story, because you only see snippets of it, or you maybe choose to follow certain characters. But what something like those stories have done, just creates such a rich palette for everybody to dive into across all of the creative team.
So that's what the myths offer, right? It's that kind of density of stories and slight vagueness, so that you can choose the things that are interesting for you. Yeah. I can't remember. Are the gods? There gods in?
There are some gods in
the Burnt City.
Yes, there is. So actually, Hades is very prominent in the show, but not necessarily overtly there. It's something for people to slowly piece together. Yeah, there's a couple of gods. Apollo's in there.
And are the gods represented as sort of divine, or do they feel a bit human?
In the way that some of their performance style, and with a god like Apollo, there is something about the costuming that makes it feel slightly otherworldly to the other characters that are in the space. But I think probably their godlike presence comes if you do actually engage with those particular performers and you see how maybe they are observing or influencing things that are happening to other characters in the space.
I mean, the big difference, the slight difference between that the Punchdrunk Birth City, which I had the privilege of seeing, and Dido's Bar, is that we have very deliberately moved Dido's Bar into a contemporary setting, and I would say Burnt City is a bit more blurred in that way. It could.
I mean, it's one of the things. It's a dreamlike reality.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like at some points there's a lot of in the creation process. There's influences of kind of Weimar Republic era. There's also 80s influences in it. There were early on in the creation process of that project. Felix, who's the artistic director of Punchdrunk, had a lot of interest in trying to find crossovers between Android's Dream of Electric Sleep, which is essentially Blade Runner, and this kind of aesthetics of that. And things have moved on because that project was actually kind of in creation for over 10 years. And yeah, that's less relevant, but some of that imagery is there, so it's like a slightly weird dystopian future, but you can't quite place what it is. It's otherworldly.
And it really is really effective. And I was just going to share that, like, what we've done with our goddesses in our version of the story, we've written out the gods altogether, which is another question I'm going to come on to in a minute. Like, what do you do with the bits that you leave behind, or what do you need to add in to make sense in a contemporary setting? But we've made our goddesses kind of have these sort of like split personalities. So they are both kind of immortal beings who are larger than life, that totally influence the world in which they live as puppeteers, and at the click of a finger can change someone's destiny. And then they have these mortal disguises that they wear in our show as bar managers, where they are just really controlling, quite manipulative, jealous sisters who are endlessly doing things just to get at each other and run the bar in a very kind of basic way, really. They're just bar managers. And I kind of loved that the goddesses can be both these kind of huge beings, but also just be petty, annoying people. And our actors have had a lot of fun with it. But it's been quite interesting to explore those old ideas of gods in a quite contemporary way, which I guess I'm going to have this opportunity now to bring in Maya, who has been able to join us.
Hello.
Thank you so much, Maya, for being here.
Thank you.
And Maya Youssef is an amazing musician and canon player who I've had the privilege of hearing and working with before. It's really nice to see you again.
Really lovely to see you again after all this time.
Yeah, it's been ages. Maya, you obviously you tackle myths and stories in quite a different way.
Yeah.
But presumably some of what we've been chatting about resonates with you. Are there particular, when you take an old story and reinterpret it through your music, are there particular stories that like appeal to you? And what's the process that you use, I suppose, when you hear and read those stories, and how do you apply them in your work?
Absolutely. I mean, I grew up reading fairy tales and myths. I used to love going. My dad had a huge library, and I used to dig out the myths of, say the myths of the Aboriginal Indians, or the myths of the Greeks and the Romans, and also the myths of the Arab world, and I used to find them really fascinating. They used to always draw me, because they take you to this dream reality where nothing applies, just everything is wide open, and things can be really dreamy and things can be really gruesome. They take the human experience and the dream experience to the extremes, really, in so many ways, which I really loved. And with honesty, it stayed with me. The stuff, it infiltrates your being. And it's only when I started writing, my first experience of writing inspired by a myth is actually also connected to refugees, is when I was thinking of the experience of the goddess Ashtar going when she banned Adonis to go to the underworld, and then she regretted it. And then she dressed in her glory, and she basically had to go through the 7 gates of the underworld to beg her shadow sister, the goddess of the underworld, Arashkigal, to give her lover back, which basically at the end gave us the cycles of spring and winter, because when she went down, it was winter. When he came up, it was spring. But it was really fascinating. And every time Ashdod went through a gate, she was stripped down by some of her jewels, and at the end, she arrived naked and furious to the very bottom, basically. And this is very much, to my thinking, was the experience of a refugee, somebody who's going to the pit of a human experience, somebody just like, leaving their home, everything, going on a boat, not knowing what was going to happen, and just risking everything, and yet having the insane courage to do it. So in a way, it's this resurrection from the underworld experience, and for that I wrote Breakthrough. It's quite a punchy, gruesome, full-on melody. But obviously that's just an immediate example, in the wider scope of my being. I believe that artists sort of, our jobs, at least that's how I see my work in the world, is our work is to refilter the human experience and to alchemize it to something that we can relate to in a human way, whether it's something beautiful, whether it's something heartbreaking, whether it's something gruesome. We're alchemizers. This is my experience of writing music, and particularly it started when the war started, because for me, I didn't write music until the war, started, and then I was faced with death, a lot of death. And for me, this is, as somebody who was scared of going to my grandmother's funeral because I was too scared to face it, and she was like one of the most seminal figures for me. She taught me how to love, and to being faced by, just losing friends disappearing, family disappearing, places destroyed, not knowing whether I'm going to see my parents or not, and my little tiny city experiencing 100 funerals a day. It was quite a shock to the system, and there was. And I suppose for me, the experience of writing music started in a way from death, because I was in my apartment in London. I was fortunate; I didn't have to experience bombs falling on my head.
Because you'd already left. You'd already left Syria sometime before.
Yeah, a long time before. I left Syria in 2007. So I was in London in 2012. I just was traveling the world working, really, but I was in London in 2012, and I remember there was a moment of my son, who was about 4, he was sleeping right next to me, and I was watching the TV, and there was an image of a small girl who looked so much like my little Adam. She died in her bedroom in Damascus. And in that moment, I was sobbing, and I held my, so I don't wake him up. And I went to my room, and I held a canoe, and music started to come out. And that was, Syrian Dreams. That was a prayer for peace. And from that point, music to me became a way to heal, to make sense, and hopefully to offer some beauty, some healing to the world through my humble experience. And I can't say that I'm at peace with death. I'm still working through it. But I have been reading about the myths of the goddess, the life goddess, who basically, it's a myth of a goddess who basically collects the bones. She's in a form of a wolf, and when she collects the bones, on a moonlight, she starts to howl, and she starts to breathe life into those bones, and then they come to life. And when I was reading about these myths that actually have, incarnations in so many parts of the world, you know, each goddess has a different name. I was like, I am more at peace with it. But yeah, I think this is one of those things that will continue to challenge us as we continue to face, you know, I mean, 2 weeks ago, a lot of people died from Syria in a boat. You know, it's happening. It could be happening now. You know, you never know.
So there's something. I mean, what you're saying is so powerful, Maya. There's something about the kind of universal, kind of those universrsal myths and stories
Absolutely.
which help us understand contemporary experience.
Yeah,
it's effectively what is effectively, I think, what you're saying, which I
absolutely
completely agree with.
Absolutely. It's this is how we integrate. I mean, our ancestors didn't tell stories and myths for leisure. They told these tales to give us wisdom, you know, to learn something. And yeah, we would be missing out if we don't look deeper into those myths, because these are things that will cycle back and many years to come.
But I also love not only just that cycling, because the cycle of it, but also just that the fact that, as you said, that the story, those stories, that the bone story can be found in different cultures. And I was thinking about, you know, because I was thinking about the story of Ashgar.
Yes.
You know, because that it's not the same, but it is a bit like the story of, I think it's Demeter who goes
Yes,
down,
exactly. It is the same one in a different
The
name.
same,
Yes.
but a different culture.
In a different culture, precisely.
There's just something so powerful about how universal those stories are. Actually, I mean, my version of coming to looking at the Aeneid for Dido's bar was sort of similar, I think, to a little bit similar to your process, which was that I met Maruf, also a refugee. It's also a refugee-based inspiration. Maruf is an extraordinary Kurdish Iranian composer who fled Iran in I don't know, like nearly 20 years ago, and I met him in Finland about 5 years ago, and he told me his story of moving to Europe, and it was such a powerful story. He's a musician. He trained in Iran, and he had to flee for artistic reasons. And he told me how it was to try to build an artistic career and find a voice as a musician in Europe, in Finland. And I just thought, this story is amazing. I really want to share his story, and also find a way of telling that story that would be one step kind of removed from that kind of personal narrative, because it was something that's universal, that so many people have gone through. I've just spent such a long time trying to work out how to tell that story in a way that would respect him, that would protect him, but would also enable others to hear it. And then it took me a long time, but in a completely different context. I remembered the story of the refugee from Troy 2,000 years ago who leaves a war-torn city, who comes to Europe to assimilate in a new place. And I just thought, that's the story. That's how I tell Maruf's story, and draw on all of that extraordinary history, all of those many times that it's been told, but look at it in a contemporary way, he's gone with us on the journey. So we've layered the two. So Maruf's story, Maruf remains at the heart of the piece. He's the composer of the show. He's in the show, in the band. And but it also is not just his story anymore. It's many, many people's stories. And then, as Colin and I were just talking about, there are bits of both stories. There are bits of his story that are in the show, and there are bits of the original myth that are in the show. And I sort of believe that it's the combination of the two, the old myths and the new story, that makes it resonate so much.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you should always, yeah, it's all about redreaming life, you know? Just what kind of dream we have to sort of like visit the current dream, which is, you know, this current reality, and then create a new, it's all this tapestry, you know. I just like, I'm thinking of how when the black people were enslaved, and the mothers stitched their stories into these huge duvets, and it was stitching of old tales, you know, and also their personal stories in line. It was like coded, so the next person who has it, he can read the stories of the people before and the current person, and then wrap it around them, so it becomes yours. This is how we grow as a species, I suppose.
It totally is. And actually, as you were saying that, I was remembering, you know, what's interesting, and there's a slight nuance because, like, there is a myth of Charon and there's a myth of Ashgar. So there's a slightly different issue and there's the myths of Troy. But we know the myths of Greece and Troy from the Burnt City. We know those stories through all the poetry and all the tragedies. So that is filtered through literature. But the big difference is that the story that I have been inspired with for Dido's Bar is a sort of written text. It's a very deliberate poem that was written inspired by older myths. But what I love about why I think it's so effective is that it comes from a history of oral storytelling, where the stories are told and told and retold and honed, and the story gets better every time you tell it, and finessed, so that it's only the best bits that get kept. And that's why that's why the old stories are so effective. It's because they've been constantly told and told again, and people get better at them when you tell a story loads of times.
I think it's interesting. Something I really picked up on was you saying the piece, saying about the need for people to remember these stories because it's got all the lessons, otherwise everything's cyclical, because it's all just about human nature and what we do. And at the beginning of this, I was asked what my myth was, but I was sort of saying that I'm not necessarily fascinated by a particular myth, but I'm quite fascinated by a tribe in South America called the Kogi. And I was sort of saying it's because they're still living in a very pure way. And they do this, they have these mummers, which are the kind of elders. And if I remember things correctly, they're young children that are chosen at quite a young age, and then they go and live, and this sounds slightly strange, but they go and live essentially in a cave for quite a number of years, and all of the other mummers come to them and tell them stories. But they're not just stories, it's also, these people see themselves as the keepers of the world, and they know all about the importance of different trees and plants and all of these things. But one thing I've always taken away from one of the documentaries I've watched about them is that every generation, they are convinced that they are losing knowledge, rather than, I feel like there's this whole Western thing where we're totally convinced that we're like becoming more and more amazing and more, you know, we know everything and with all the science, but we keep on forgetting to revisit all of these things. And so that's why it's important that I think artists do go back to these stories when they can, because it resonates with people anyway, and it helps us remind us all of these things that we know. And it was strange with the Burnt City, because as I said, that project, the idea of looking at the Trojan War had been floating around as a Punchdrunk project for a long time, and it was always waiting for the right building and the right opportunity to come up. And then it felt, I don't know, it sort of felt strange for everyone as it all started to come together. And you know, we were looking to open in the March, and then in the February, everything that starts happening in Ukraine, and you're just like, you know, it's like, does no one learn anything?
Yeah, it is heartbreaking.
Actually, I was going to ask that, and it sort of it carries on really from what you were saying, Colin, which is like, is there one of the things that I've thought a lot about when we were taking that old myth and in reinterpreting it in a contemporary way, is that times have changed so fundamentally. So, you know, in the original story, there is, we know of the amazing Dido, but she'd probably in Virgil's story, she probably would fail the Bechdel test. I mean, she commits suicide because she gets abandoned by her lover. And then the other woman in the story doesn't even get a voice. I mean, she's Lavinia. She's totally like, there's one brilliant moment when her hair is set on fire in the original story, and that's how we know she's special, because she's got fiery hair, but she doesn't say a word, and she's the great love interest of the story. So I just felt like it would be we could not tell us a contemporary version of that story without giving more agency and voices to the women. So I definitely thought quite a lot about how do we bring things up to date and make more sense of them in a contemporary way. And I imagine that's stuff that you think about a lot in your work, and I'd be interested in what your thoughts are. Like, you know, are there things that you avoid, that are, or ways that you, or are there Are you, I mean, how do you ensure that there's a kind of contemporary resonance in when you deal with these old stories?
I mean, for me, so the way I write music, I just listen. It's a process of listening. So if there's too much noise in my head, then I just go meditate and just really listen. And it's a process. I mean, sometimes I talk to the source of inspiration and call her the muse, you know, like. So for me, it's just being really true. And I mean, for me, I'm first of all just going back to the point about being a woman. I mean, I was told at a very young age that I should not be playing my instrument because I am a woman, you know. So I heard my instrument. I was 8. By that stage, my parents put me up in a music institute because, you know, I was surrounded by music and I was tapping and singing all the time. And then when there was the time to pick a musical instrument, they chose the violin for me, which I wasn't very keen on. And then basically my mother was taking me to a lesson, and in the backseat of a taxi, he turned the radio on, and there came the sound of the qanun, my instrument. I was like, that's the instrument I want to play. And he laughed at me at 8, yes. And he laughed at me. He said, "Oh, you're a girl. This instrument is for men." So it was really funny because that very night the head of the institute walks in and announces a qanun class. So it was very much meant to be. So for me, it's just like, you know, if you ask me, Maya, why is the qanun not a woman's instrument? I would say it's just because, my personal interpretation is because it's a power instrument. Because the minute you have that thing on your lap, that's it. The spotlight is on you, and in a way, it's a signage that women should not be radically powerful. And until the very day and age that people call me radical, which is fine. I'm past that. So going into, you know, being a woman and embodying this ancient tradition of the instrument and the ancient tradition of, you know, because, you know, the matriarchs were really, it was a matriarchal society. I am also of a lineage of strong, phenomenal women.
So you were basically, in answer to the question, you were already starting from a place of knowing that you had to reinterpret.
I had to reinterpret it, but I mean, this came much later, you know. I just, much later, you know, until I became really conscious of why. Why? You know, because you spend a lot of time, which is why it's so important. Stories sort of gives you a wake-up call, you know, go like, oh yeah, actually, why am I doing this thing this way? So it's very important for me to be true to myself, to the muse, to my lineage and to my heritage in a way that is authentic. And so many times this shows up in a completely contemporary way. I mean, I am funny enough now, as we speak, I just finished writing, you know, pieces of music inspired by an old Damascene house in London, Leighton House Museum. So in a way, I'm reinterpreting, you know, mosaic walls and golden domes into music, and in a way these, and I was in conversation with like people who are intimately knowledgeable about the architecture of Damascus, and you know, the symbology of that. Everything has a symbol. Nothing is just abstract. And it's just to tell the stories. So many of it is just a subtle telling of stories. So for me, in a way, it's just being true to what the you know, the object is trying to tell me. Just to give the emotional charge without overthinking it. You know, even if it's radical, if it's gruesome, if it's, you know, because in so many ways it just comes, like, for instance, one of the pieces that I wrote is with qanun and choir, and it was the first time I'm writing it. I was like, really, honestly, why choir? Why? I suppose it's all, as long as I am rooted in my tradition, and this is the way I see myself, because I see myself as a tree. I am deeply rooted in that old tradition, in the stories of my people.
Then you can
The branches can go whatever.
That's a beautiful way of seeing it. And you really exude that. And I suppose I am totally privileged to have know a little bit of the old classical story of the Aeneid, so that has given me the freedom to completely reinterpret it. I think if I were coming to something that I wouldn't have such a kind of some knowledge of having studied like 20 years ago, that wouldn't give me that freedom. But actually, it links me to a question that Julian asked, which was about, which we got some messages in, and do send us if anyone's got any other questions, let us know. Julian asked about the casting of Dido's Bar. Julian kindly came to see the show a few weeks ago, and wanted to know what the casting decisions were on how I had cast Aeneas and Dido in our version, because they're quite. It was really important for me that we would find contemporary ways of telling this old story. Obviously, Maruf himself is from Iran. It would have been totally brilliantly wonderful to find a Kurdish Iranian performer, actor, musician who could play lots of instruments, basically be Maruf on stage alongside Maruf in the band. But what I ended up doing was to think slightly differently about, it's really important for me that our hero, our Aeneas character, who is the refugee who comes to Europe, it was really important for me that they were not themselves kind of ethnically European. We've cast the most brilliant Moroccan-French actor, Lassam, who plays this phenomenal Aeneas, and he's able to draw on his background, his heritage, his language, his history. He has roots from further south down into Nigeria. So all of that kind of wealth of the culture of the world, he kind of enriches his understanding of playing that character. So it's been that decision on the casting influenced the role. Dido is played by Lola May, whose background is half Eritrean and half Nigerian, and we've definitely been working together on understanding particularly her Eritrean heritage, how that influenced her understanding of Dido being a refugee and coming to Europe. Similarly, in fact, everybody we're privileged to have a phenomenal international cast. So between them, I think they speak about 7 or 8 different languages. And one of the most interesting bits of that is the character who plays Turnus, because Turnus is the anti-hero of our show. He's the local boy that Aeneas has to sort of displace in order to become the ruler of, in the original story, the king of, the antecedent of the Emperor Augustus, like the king of Italy. And Turnus is destined to be that person. And in our version of the show, because we've moved it all to a music club, Turnus is the local music star, and he's going to have to be kicked out in order for Aeneas to join and become the star in his place. And because Maruf's version of Europe, of the local boy, is Finland, we've brought in, it's been totally wonderful to work with our Finnish actor Tukka, who's the local boy. So Tukka is not just Finnish by background, but sings in Finnish and brings Finnish into the show. And we've really been inspired. The music is quite, it draws on Finnish folk music and so on. So it's not just casting decisions that have, the actors themselves have been able to bring their background into the understanding of the show, but where possible, actually, because we've been working on the production over a couple of years through a process of really quite slow research and development sessions, it's enabled us to work with some of the actors already, so that the casting decisions influence the content. It's a two-way process. So it's. Thank you, Julian, for asking the question. It's a really fundamental part of the show, actually. The decisions around the casting have really influenced the direction and Hattie's writing and Maruf's music. Do you have any thoughts on interesting things, kind of things that you ignore or things that you should be thinking about now that we might not have, that feel quite resonant in a contemporary way?
I mean, personally, with the work that I'm starting to make for myself, I'm trying to make more work that actually can kind of hold and calm people as opposed to shock them. I mean, I definitely, look, Mike, I just think the world is so unsettled now, and I think the work that I'm gravitating towards when I'm going out to see other things are things that I find very calming and peaceful and meditative, and so those themes are coming through in projects that I'm developing myself. And I think, I mean, also I think there's something that feels like it's becoming less of a taboo subject, everything around mental health, and I'm feeling that kind of work it is also, I feel some of that is coming into some of my thoughts about things. But I work on a very much, it was interesting what you were saying earlier about, you know, the decisions you make. I know for myself personally, ultimately what I'm interested in is things that have, because most of my work is all tied up with experiential things, and you know, I'm not a theatre director. You know, Punchdrunk shows are directed by Felix and Maxine. I fit within the whole kind of creative team and the wider team trying to put them together. But what I'm always drawn to is emotional responses and things, and so that's always at the driver of what I'm trying to do. And I found it fascinating when you were talking through all the decisions you made and you got to the end of it and it was actually like, well, does it feel right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, for me, music is a spiritual thing. I pray before I write music. I pray before I go on stage. I pray to bring peace and healing, and then I have to listen. and that's the skill that I really have to sort of fine tune. Absolutely, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's, you know, if as long as the birds sing, and as long as, you know, you see a beautiful flower or you hear a beautiful piece of music and you feel that this world is a good place to be at, it's just the beautiful, meaningful, the small things really that hold us, you know, and give us that enrichment. And yeah, I completely relate to that. It's I mean, before, I suppose, in the first album, in Syrian Dreams, it was, I felt, because, you know, everything was very much raw still, you know, it was still, you know, trying to make sense of it. But now that the waters have calmed, it's, yeah, it's rather than being driven by a river and not knowing where am I going to end up, I feel that I'm in a conversation with the divine, really, to bring that peace, even in a small way, you know.
And is that, I mean, what's interesting is that you're both using, and I suppose I would include this in myself, you know, like we're using the myths to make sense of our world today in different ways. But what's interesting for me is just noticing that, Maya, you were saying that in some ways some of those harsher, darker myths were quite helpful as a way of understanding and trying to kind of filter through a contemporary experience. Whereas what you're effectively saying, if I'm right, Colin, is that actually you're looking for myths that are going to not won't necessarily make sense of the world, but help heal the world a bit. So drawing on things that provide more healing rather than difficult things that we can tell again in different ways.
I think at this particular moment in time, that's where my head's at. Yeah. But I would say within it, the light is only possible with acceptance of the dark. And I think also, again, with my own kind of personal practice, I don't necessarily look for stories. I'm working in my own work is very much more around kind of sound and visual stimuluses and things. But within that, it's actually interesting about the light and dark. So there's a project that I've been doing over recent years, which is called Beyond the Road, it's essentially we deconstructed music and rebuilt it three-dimensionally, and you walk through it, and it's like a walk-through album experience, and there's lots of visual stimulus in it, which is so it's all based around the band Uncle and all the imagery there, and essentially we've created this, for better or worse terms, an immersive album experience. But it's a unique thing. You can only be sort of in it, and it's living and breathing because the lighting's constantly changing, and the music, you only hear the strings in one part of the space and you're here synth in another part, and as you're kind of moving around, you're essentially mixing the music. You're only ever in one piece of music, but it sounds different depending on where you are. So anyway, this piece, and it's interesting, we took it to Korea. We did it in London, and then we managed to take it to Korea last year in the middle of the pandemic, which was quite an undertaking, but we pulled it off. And in the process of working with our producer out there, who'd seen it in London and loved it as an entirety, but she was obviously bringing it there, and she had other people that she was working with, and some of the kind of visual imagery, there is a darkness to it. And James Avell and Uncle, like, if as a band and, you know, as a musician, like, they are playing around with a lot of these themes, and so it comes out in the imagery that's there. And for us, Beyond the Road is actually like a sound spa. It's actually hugely meditative, and that's the way me and Stephen, who kind of create it, feel about it. And in these conversations with our producer out there, we were trying to kind of say that it's okay for these kind of dark moments to be in this, because ultimately the overall feeling that you come out with is actually you've become calm, but you do see these things that are actually challenging. And she was like trying to kind of get us to kind of take some of it out, and we were like, we can't, like, this is all part of it.
I was going to say that, really, exactly that point, Colin. Like, to me, you need them both in there, and I think the kind of great artistic work has a bit of both, has that sense of, you know, like understanding, going to the dark place in order to understand something, and then to get the healing from it. And I was chatting last week with Marif about what's going on in Iran at the moment, because it's impossible to ignore contemporary politics, and I'm working with him daily, and we are not directly explicitly talking about the place, the Troy for Marif is Iran, but we obviously, he is a Kurdish Iranian, and what's going on at the moment is incredibly painful for him. And I was just asking, you know, he was sharing with me his reflections on how it is for his family and how his hope and optimism. He's an extraordinary individual. But he said to me, he said, you know, it's really helpful doing this show at the moment. He said, and as we know from the epic stories, he says, you know, lightness will always win over the darkness. And that's what we get from these stories, is that opportunity. So I really hope that we could take the lightness, draw it, and carry on throwing it out into the world as artists and producers and makers.
And it's actually interesting, this conversation has made me just think about looking for some stories that might help with a particular project we're working at the moment. Because at the moment, its starting point is just about a calming environment, but I actually think we maybe need to
bring in a bit of darkness, just to offset it.
And I might go looking for a story. It's not normally what I do, but we might do that.
Colin, I'm glad we've inspired you. So we'll watch that space for Colin's project, and also the Burnt City's playing and forever now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's booking till April. There was a new batch of tickets put on sale. And there's a range, like, I think under 25s and local people, there are some £25 tickets. Otherwise, they're from like £55. And yeah, it's running till April.
And well worth going to visit, if only for the amazing location, and the sets are phenomenal, and the story's great too. And Maya, your album's out?
Yes, it has been out for a while, and yes, you can see it on road.
And you have a gig coming up.
Well, I have, yes. The premiere of the Leighton House Commission is sold out, which is next week. But then you can come to St Martin in the Fields on 1st November. And
Leighton House is also beautiful.
It's gorgeous, and all the details are on my website, mayayoussef.com/event.
Thank you, Maya. And Dido's Bar, you can catch Dido's Bar. It's playing until the 29th of October in Oxford, and I also want to do a little advert for the other talk that we've done. So I'm totally privileged to have been able to chat to you both live, but there's also another talk called The Refugee Experience on Stage, which we recorded a few days ago, and it's coming out. The premiere on YouTube is next Monday at 1 p.m, Monday the 17th of October. Is that right? Monday the 17th? Yeah, at 1 p.m. p.m., which is a gorgeous talk I was part of with some phenomenal artists, thinking about what it is to be a refugee and how to reflect it with sensitivity and thoughtfulness on the stage, which ties in very nicely with your thoughts earlier, Maya. And just thank you so much, Colin and Maya, for joining us, and our brilliant production team, and for making this happen. And I hope you enjoy it.